Crime thrillers, psychological horror and hard-hitting drama. Phillip Noyce is behind some of the biggest films of the 1990s and 2000s, directing Harrison Ford, Denzel Washington, Nicole Kidman and Angelina Jolie, to name just a handful. The producer and director is being celebrated at the Cinémathèque Française here in Paris with a retrospective of 17 of his features and some of his shorts too. He joins us now to tell us more. Phillip Noyce, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
Now, looking back at your body of work, there's action, there's historical drama, there's suspense. It runs the whole gamut of human emotions. When you look back at these movies, can you identify a sort of hallmark, something that makes them a Phillip Noyce film?
Well, the movies are divided into two sections in a way. The films that I made in Australia, which are more from my heart, and the films that I made in and for Hollywood, which are other people's stories that I was lending my craft to. So what makes them distinctive, most distinctive, I would say, is probably a left-leaning philosophy, challenging authority, which you can see even in the American films, Clear and Present Danger, Patriot Games, and in the Australian films in particular, Rabbit Proof Fence, which opened the retrospective here in Paris.
That auteur voice that has been celebrated here in France. Well, let's take a look at some of those features. Here's a quick glimpse of the cinema of Phillip Noyce. Now, you mentioned early films made in Australia. If we look back to the film Dead Calm, 1989, it was applauded for its masterful handling of tension. It was a huge box office hit and it introduced the world to a young lady named Nicole Kidman. The film was shot in Australia, produced by fellow Australian filmmaker George Miller, and it propelled you to Hollywood. Tell us a bit about that transition at the time, going from the Australian film industry to LA.
Well, the film came out, and suddenly for myself and Nicole, the phone wouldn't stop ringing, and it was Hollywood calling, come over, join us. It was a very exciting time, but overwhelming in a way as well. Joining the studio system. In Australia, we'd made films on the smell of an oil rag, and suddenly, we had a giant studios throwing money at us, taking care of hypnotizing the audience all around the world to see the movies, guaranteeing their success, whether the movies were good, bad, or indifferent. The Hollywood system is more efficient even than Rome, because Rome needed a sword to conquer the world. Hollywood conquers the hearts and minds, or had done in its peak, of people all over the world. And they did that for us filmmakers. So, I went to Hollywood and made 4 films in 10 years when I might have expected to make 1 perhaps in 10 years back in Australia. So it was thrilling, but it was also sad in a way, because I felt lost in Hollywood. I felt like I was a gun for hire. I wasn't making films from my heart. So after 10 years, I went back to make Rabbit Proof Fence.
And I absolutely want to come on to that. But it's interesting that you mentioned the American attitude there, because those films starring Harrison Ford, Patriot Games, Clear and Present Danger, based on the Tom Clancy literary creation, Jack Ryan, these were real action heroes, a force for good in the world, on the world stage. How have you seen the image of the United States evolve since then?
Well, the story of America post-Second World War is a story of successful and then complete failure in terms of being the sheriff for the rest of the world. And several of my films have concentrated on that, starting with The Quiet American, adapted from the novel by Graham Greene, which foretold the Vietnam tragedy of 30 years for the French and Americans and their allies. And going through to Clear and Present Danger, which of course is about the corruption within the American political system. The intervention in Japan and Korea was successful, the nation building that America embarked on. But it's a long time since Korean War and many failures of intervention since. So I think America now, even after the Trump era, is in a reduced eminence in the world. And I don't think that the election of a liberal government has changed anything, even from the extremities of the Trump era.
You mentioned that desire to go back and work in Australia, and from the very beginning of your career and the film Backroads in 1977, Phillip Noyce has been interested in Australia's history, especially revisiting the version of it as told by its white colonisers. That interest eventually resulted in the critically acclaimed film Rabbit Proof Fence in 2002. Loosely based on a true story, it follows 3 young girls who are taken from their families and placed in so-called re-education camps. They then resolve to make a very long journey home. Let's take a look. So for many of us outside of Australia who weren't so aware of that history, how Indigenous people were treated, this was a really shocking watershed moment. How was that film received in Australia?
When I set out to make the film, everyone said, you'll never find the finance to make a story of Indigenous Australians. And even if you do, no one in Australia in particular will ever want to see this story. And I was determined to prove them wrong, and we proved them completely wrong. And the film was a huge success all around the world, and modestly for an art house film, and has been seen by a huge number of Australians, and has been a part of the curriculum for school children ever since the year 2002. So it's had a big effect, and in fact, it led to an official apology to those Indigenous people, First Nations people, who had been separated from their parents and sent to these re-education centres. Of course, this is not a problem that's confined to Australia. We've just seen more evidence of the abuse of Native Americans, Native Canadians in Canada in the same institutions.
Now, there have been a number of initiatives in the film industry to increase diversity. Here in Paris, for example, we will have the Indigenous Australian Film Festival kicking off next month. As someone who's perhaps behind the scenes, how have you seen the evolution of that question? More diversity, is there progress?
Well, in Australia, and I'd really recommend to anyone who's in Paris to go and have a look at the Indigenous Australian Film Festival, because that's the new wave. Indigenous Australians, there's been a concerted effort by the authorities to educate, to give opportunity to Indigenous writers and directors and actors, and there has emerged a great number of really vital filmmakers, men and women, who have vital stories to tell, much more urgency than us white Australians, because this is the hidden history of Australia. And that's the new wave, and that's where, the cogency is in Australian cinema.
A great tip for a film festival then. So coming back to more recent projects, your film Lakewood was completed this year. Now it stars Naomi Watts, who basically single-handedly carries this film. She's on her own for most of the time. It was filmed during the pandemic, I believe, so necessity was the mother of invention there in terms of shooting these solo scenes. How did that work?
Well, when I was offered the film, I'd been in lockdown, as all of Hollywood was, for about 6 or 7 months. So the opportunity to go to Northern Ontario and make a film outside with mainly one actor, and an actor that I'd admired since she was a teenager back in Sydney, and seen her career rise and rise and rise through art house films and great box office success. So it was the perfect antidote to the lockdown. We got to shoot. It was done fast and on the run, but turned out great.
So creativity prevails in the end. But finally, we asked you for a cultural tip or recommendation. It's no surprise you flagged a film, Denis Villeneuve's Dune, which was released here in France recently. Now, given the cult value of Frank Herbert's 1965 novel, people are very attached to it. The stakes were high. So why were you impressed by this version?
You know, Denis Villeneuve combined the best of epic cinema of David Lean with an art house sensibility, and the combination is mesmerizing. It also features a great performance from Timothée Chalamet, as well as great music from Hans Zimmer, and the cinematography from the Australian Greg Fraser is spellbinding. So I think my prediction is that it's going to do very well at the upcoming American Oscars.
And it certainly has everything to get people back into cinemas after that pandemic.
And don't wait to stream it at home. Don't wait for it to come on to your cable network. Go and see it in a cinema, because this is big screen cinema at its best.
Phillip Noyce, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll leave you with a glimpse of some of the action on the planet Arrakis with Timothée Chalamet, Oscar Isaac and Charlotte Rampling in Dune. Otherwise, you can get more arts and culture on our website and on our social media feeds too. There's more news coming up on France 24 just after this.
If anything happens, will you protect Paul?
With my life.
Only together can we stand a chance.
It's time.
France by France 24. From the workshop to the catwalk, follow the latest trends on fashion. From fine dining to architecture and much more, discover uniquely French talents on You Are Here. Straight talking and frank views from residents of France's tough suburbs who film their lives for the Bonheur Project. An in-depth look at political and social events shaping France in France in Focus. A quirky insider's guide to understanding France and the French on French Connections. Every day, watch France by France 24 on France 24 and France24.com.